So for everybody that just joined us, my name is Mark Luperto. I'm the marketing manager at Epoch Xperience. We are joined by Ross Thorn, who is a cartographer currently working with Facebook, I believe, if I read that correctly. Now, Ross, you are, I would say, heavily educated in cartography. You've got a Master's of Science, Bachelor's of Science. Both, I think the Master's is in cartography, specifically the Bachelor's was in geoscience, if I'm correct.
Yep, geoscience and geography.
Geography, very nice. So what, it's a very specific field. How do you kind of just land into it? How do you get started in cartography and why?
Yeah, to start, it was I had gone to school to play basketball, and then I ended up quitting that, and then didn't really know what to do, and didn't choose a school based on like, oh, they've got a good program in X or Y. But I really always liked geology, and so I did geoscience first, and then it was a couple more credits to get a geography degree, and found my way to like mapping software, GIS, specifically geographic information systems, and kind of went from there and learned about that and how we take real world data and put it into a digital space on, we're not scrawling much anymore with like a pen and paper or something like that. A lot of it's digital, but yeah. And then, so after that, I went on to get my master's degree in mostly studying interactive cartography.
And what specifically, when you say interactive cartography, is that more so thinking like Google Maps?
Yep. Yeah, typically that's like the default of what I would sort of explain it to is web mapping. Google Maps is really a good way to do it. Not necessarily routing or anything, but more of just how do we put a map, what we call slippy maps, typically, where you can like drag and zoom and stuff like that. And
Okay.
yeah.
So I would think if we're, getting right into interactive map making, I think it's a good segue into what we do at Epic, which is, we work specifically in video games and war games. And I would think, in a sense, interactive mapping would also be like building a map for a video game. And we talked very briefly before, you haven't worked with the developers before, but you have created interactive maps before.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to talk about it briefly, I think one of your first was a Dungeons and Dragon map. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did. I first made like just a fantasy map for a Dungeons and Dragon campaign that I was a part of, and I wanted to use like the real world mapping software to do it, and so just kind of like arbitrarily putting these in real world coordinates, and then can kind of manipulate those using real world mapping tools like Mapbox, and so that they become interactive maps that the people in my group can pull up on their phones or a laptop, and we can kind of see. And then I did a couple for Critical Role, their world, and have released those too. So
Okay, very nice. And what do you think? Talking specifically about like Dungeons and Dragons, because that's borders kind of wargaming in a sense. If
yeah.
you add a couple elements, but how does that add to the experience when you build something like that?
Yeah, I think that mapping in general adds a lot in the immersiveness. So in my thesis, I kind of outline a couple principles of playful maps, and one big one is immersiveness and how we think about being both immersed in the game. It's like in the act of playing a game, as well as in the game, in the world of the game. And so if I'm looking at a depiction of the world of this fantasy world, I can imagine myself, oh, we're here, we're just a couple miles from there or whatever. And I think it just becomes easier to sort of close that gap between the identity you're assuming in this world and your own identity.
Okay. And do you think that kind of also translates to a digital game, like say Assassin's Creed or Legend of Zelda?
Totally. And I think Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is such a great example, because like they use like all sorts of like little nuanced elements of like you're playing on the Switch, and then Link has the Sheikah slate, and it looks just like what Link is holding. And so it's so much easier to do that when they use those sort of tools to do it.
Okay. So you mentioned your thesis, and I wish I had the time to read all like 120 pages of it. That looked like it was quite the undertaking, and I'm wondering, how did you kind of launch into, because the thesis is mostly, from what I gathered, about gaming and maps and map making. Um, how did you start to even piece all that together? Because you referenced quite a bit as you kind of got deeper into it.
Yeah. I didn't know what to do my thesis on, and I was really troubled on like something that I thought might be cool. And I think the other topic I kind of was exploring was augmented reality mapping, which I thought would be super cool, but I had no real connection, no idea of where to even begin of prototyping something like that to test it or anything. And then I thought back to like the first map I ever used was in a video game. It was the paper map that came with Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind.
Okay.
And so I'm sitting on my couch in elementary school, just like looking at this piece of paper and looking at the interactive map too. And like, okay, so I can go there and that's where this location is. And so that's what kind of inspired me. And I just thought that it is, once I had that sort of idea, it clicked that there's this whole branch of cartography that I'd like to consider a branch of cartography that's made by traditional non-cartographers, of people that probably don't have like like you said, my sort of experience of getting your education in cartography and in geography, and then looking at how they're making these maps that are actually really effective and for a specific purpose. And I think that there is a two-way street of where games could learn from the traditional schools of cartography, as well as where traditional cartography can learn from how these game designers and developers create maps.
And do you have anything kind of off the top of your head where that could cross paths, where, say, traditional cartography could, learn from the map makers of, even games from 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite examples is like mobile mapping, and how we use Google Maps to navigate, and how mini maps are docked in a corner, and how they sort of handle things, or with a heads-up display, especially with things like augmented reality sort of on the forefront of things that could be coming to our reality soon. I think that there's a lot of cool overlap and a lot of cool design decisions and experience decisions that were more possible in a digital world before they were possible in our world. And so we can kind of look to those to do that.
Okay. And I want to kind of circle back. You mentioned the Elder Scrolls 3 map, which I remember when it came with the physical map, and I can't remember the last game that came with the physical map. Maybe like Grand Theft Auto 4 was one of the last that wasn't a part of like a collector's edition. What's the value, do you think, of having that in your hand? Something that you can kind of pin to your wall. It's in game, so you have access to it, but it's still, it's still there. You still have this man-made layout, so to speak.
Yeah, well, Skyrim also came with one too that sort of had like this papyrus feel. It was actually, to me, it was less useful, and it was just more decorative. Whereas like the Morrowind one, I think, was decorative as well, but it had more points on it. It had like mysterious red X's on there that they just kind of don't mention what they were, and you're like, what's there? And so I think it was really effective to bridge that immersion, and to be like, I am holding this physical object of this virtual world, and I feel it's so much easier when I refer to my own character as me, and which I love seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned kind of the mysterious points of the Morrowind map. Do you think when video game map makers kind of go into these bigger scale maps, that they're looking to add little points that they reference something that a gamer will want to look at, but they don't make it so obvious, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Maybe. I think that explain what you mean exactly.
So, like on the Morrowind map, they would physically mark off a red X.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go in to design a real world map that doesn't, or a map that doesn't exist in the real world, I should say. So they're building from the ground up, the terrain, the locations, and everything. Do you think in the back of their mind they're thinking, I want to make this look ominous in some aspect so that people will think that they have to explore it.
Yeah, I think so. And that's actually another principle that I thought of, or that I talk about in my thesis too, is incompleteness of maps. So when you have that fog of war effect covering the areas you haven't explored, it evokes that sense of adventure, and it makes people it makes me especially want to go and discover that and complete my map. And interestingly enough, I think that's one of the hardest things to translate to real world mapping when we try to, evoke or, take these same principles that were outlined in the thesis of interactivity, immersiveness, incompleteness, and I call it inclusiveness, but I retroactively call it interpersonal, whereas they're social things. I think incompleteness is probably one of the hardest ones to actually translate, because you want to show as much as possible without it being frustrating. But
Okay.
games have that beautiful, unique perspective to use that frustration as a motivator to play.
Okay, that's a great point. Do you have a specific game in mind that I think utilized that best?
I think a lot of the Ubisoft games of like Assassin's Creed, with those towers, and same thing with Far Cry 2, of where you have to do some sort of feat to unlock more information that will aid you in whatever quests or tasks that you're doing in the game. So yeah, I think a lot of times maybe they could be done wrong or like poorly done in that they're boring or something like that. But I love anything that makes me unlock parts of the map and have to work for it.
So are you somebody that when they come out with, say, a new Grand Theft Auto comes out or a new Assassin's Creed comes out, are you looking at the size of the map to see how excited you'll be for that game?
Not necessarily the size, no. Because
More detail?
I know those huge worlds, and that you'll sometimes see those viral videos of comparing map sizes of video games, and I love seeing those. I think those are cool, but that's not necessarily something I pay attention to when hyping myself up for a game.
Okay, so you're more so kind of the details of everything.
Yeah, the details, how, what are some unique and novel things that they're doing in their maps that sort of make me want to use the map, or what are they maybe not doing so well that I'm like, this is a terrible experience trying to use this thing and it's not helping me.
Can you think of a game where that may have been the case, where you just kind of, disassociated yourself from using the map entirely?
Yeah, BioShock 1 for sure.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they show the floor plan and then they just have like red arrows going like everywhere of like, because it's all side by side, even if it's a multi-floor complex, and then just like these red arrows pointing, oh, this leads to here. And it's just like so much legwork that your brain has to do, rather than like, I mean, Ocarina of Time had it easily where you could just toggle between floors, like, and that came out 10 years prior.
Yeah. I mean, even Doom did it a little bit better than BioShock. That's right.
Yeah, they learned in BioShock 2 to actually just do the floor toggle thing.
Okay. So yeah, that's okay. So we've got an example of the worst. Do you have a map that you'd like to? I mean, not that you play the game specifically for the map, but when you launch the game, you know that you're kind of getting a really good map with it.
Yeah. Man, I think there's a couple. I think I easily default to Breath of the Wild because it's gorgeous, and like I said, that experience that they just could sort of tailor. But another really notable one that I've loved using was in Firewatch. Um, you basically hold up like this topographic map, and you see your character hold up with their arm this map, and that's a very immersive thing to me, of like, okay, I'm looking at this paper map, and the way I zoom in is he literally just brings it closer to his face, and it's just like, yeah, this is great. I love this.
Sounds a lot like how the mapping in like Sea of Thieves works.
Yes.
It's very much so. There's no really frame of reference except for the one spot of your ship, and then you just kind of have to figure it out from there.
Which is cool. I love, I'm not while I'm, a cartographer that loves maps and games, I don't think every game needs a map, and I don't think, that you should make it just like accessible all the time. Like in Sea of Thieves, that's a great immersion tool of like, yeah, you're on a pirate ship and there's a physical map in this location and you don't take it with you. So you have to go there to look at it.
Yeah. I think in a sense I think that builds the immersion. I think just as you had said, kind of builds it a little tenfold than being able to just press like tab or, select.
Yeah,
And the already completed map pops up on your screen.
exactly.
So at Epic, we focus mostly on historical gaming. Games like Assassin's Creed, they have these maps that are based on real life locations. So in Odyssey, it was obviously Greece, if I recall, Athens. Um, do you think that when a developer goes in and starts to build out this map, that they have to have some level of authenticity in mind? Or do you think it would maybe be beneficial for the game that they go a little more unique?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that there's a really cool balance that I've seen of making sure that you get these iconic pieces of authenticity, so that like if you're making a game of New York, that you've got the Empire State Building, or like in Assassin's Creed 2, that they've got that basilica in Florence, that's there, and that's an iconic piece. But sort of beyond that, it might be kind of boring in the real world to navigate some of those things. And so like if you can mindfully shrink things down to, or maybe even expand it to, like flex it to whatever serves the purpose of the game, um like I think that'll serve the game itself then. And
Okay.
so having that balance between accurate and historically important too, but then also, okay, is this going to be fun? Or like if they're driving across Chicago, is it going to take them 3 hours because that's the traffic's so bad and it's a long time,
Yeah, I gotcha. And I guess not to like veer away from history that I just put it onto, but you got to think of like the new Spider-Man game coming out. I think the biggest critique everybody always has about those games is that they're always in New York. Even from Spider-Man 2, the map maybe expands, but the locations stay the same.
Right.
So I guess if we want to relate that to history, if people are doing like a World War II game, somebody else does another Normandy invasion, is it beneficial to them, for them and for the player, for them to create kind of their own map of Normandy rather than recreate what's been done? God, it's got to be like 100 times at this point.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too, of where, like, if you're doing, in Spider-Man or in Grand Theft Auto, when, or, like, these are fictional stories that take place in real places. If you're doing a game based on a real event, that spatiality is hyper important. So that's where I think you kind of often err on that authenticity side. But yeah, if it's been done so much, how do you freshen that up? That's a great question. And if I had the answer, I don't.
Well, there may not even be a clear-cut answer. It could be just
Yeah.
player-specific, of course. And again, they've tackled Normandy in so many different ways that it's hard to say if a new viewpoint of it, or even a kind of a fake, we'll sort of say, version of it would be beneficial to the player, so it feels more new and kind of fresh. So then, do you think, let's say you are picked up by Ubisoft to build, I don't know, a Japanese setting for the next Assassin's Creed game. Would you go into that with the concern of, okay, this was a real place, these were real cities, these were real locations, and in a sense, these are real stories, because sometimes Assassin's Creed likes to throw in, a little bit of history in there.
Right.
Would you go into that map thinking, I have to take what was real and kind of find a way to make it fit into this game map? Do I have to, is it best for me to completely change the setting, or should I keep it as close to the real thing as possible? Like, is that your first thought, or is your first thought kind of, how do I fit this around the narrative that is going to be there?
Yeah, probably. I guess, yeah, if it were up to me, and sort of doing that world building space of working with historians and because I know they've got some dedicated teams to that too, of making that accuracy. I think, ultimately in my mind, it comes down to that player experience. And I think about this when I make a map too, of like, is if I add a bunch of these icons, and if it's more representative of all the data I've got, is that going to be a good experience? And if it's too cluttered, then it's not. And I need to I need to tone some stuff back and tweak some decisions that I'm making. And so I think I'd probably take the same approach of okay, let's knowing that the franchise though is focusing and lasering in on that authenticity. Like let's find out those key things that we definitely need. Like, okay, so what were some structures? What were these things? What was the actual distance between these cities? And how can we then make that a fun experience? But then prioritize that after kind of outlining those key touchstones.
Okay. So do you have, you're not like a historical gamer specifically, but do you have, if you could build a historical period or a historical moment in time, a map based on that, is there something that you would ever touch on or would want to touch on?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like I would probably, if you would have asked me that when I was a kid, I'd be like, man, I love medieval stuff. Like, just give me more medieval stuff. And then that's been X amount of years now. And so there's tons of medieval stuff that has like scratched that itch for me. So, I don't think I actually have a favorite period or anything like that.
Okay. And that's fine. There's so many different things to choose from that, but I like that you brought up medieval, because that kind of leads into another question I have, where when you think of medieval battles, you think you've got ground units, you've got ranged units, and a lot of the times those range units relied on height.
Mm-hmm.
When you're building a map, or if you're going to go build a map, and you know that there's going to be a ranged unit that could actually benefit from a higher standpoint, do you consider that in the actual building of the final map? Or is it, if it's there, it kind of winds up being in there and the players can use it? Or, is it kind of like an afterthought?
Definitely. I think, that's part of that gameplay of how do we design these map decisions into, it's more than just putting the waypoints and stuff like that. It's okay. In Breath of the Wild, like, if we can come back to that, they use a topographic map with contour lines because you can literally go anywhere, and your stamina bar is important to keep in mind. So like, if this is a cliff face, and then climbing it is going to take some time. You can't do it when it's rainy, and it's really important to know that knowledge. And I think the same thing is, if I've got ranged units that are going to be up high, I'm going to want to see topography either in contour lines, or if it's, makes sense to make the map 3D, then let's come in at this like oblique angle and show this landscape. So then I know, okay, let me put those units in higher locations. I think that's crucial in a lot of those decisions, as long as it's supporting that gameplay.
Okay. So let's touch on something that you do quite frequently, which is the actual building of maps. You work with, is it with Facebook, or you're with, I think it's Stamen?
Stamen, yep.
Building maps for Facebook.
Yep.
So all right, you're given a project and you said you need to create a map of, this area. What is your first thought, and what's the first thing you have to consider?
Yeah, I think the first thing is probably just who is the audience that is going to be using this, and what are they going to be using it for? That's the big one, and that helps to guide a lot of the decisions out from there. And I think it's really important to keep that user-centric design in whatever project, and sort of just like we talked about with the ranged units and stuff, of like having that gameplay and knowing the strategies that players will use. I need to bring the map design back to that. So, if it's, I'm making an app for people to find, hotels or something like that, or, checking in on social media, or, navigating in their car. What are all of these decisions, and how can I keep those at the forefront?
I like that you touched on that this is all about the audience, and it's the same with gaming. When you're thinking about what you're building, it's always about the audience. So it's good to know that when you're building a map just for some like everyday use, it's the same thing as somebody who's building a map for somebody that's going to be playing, years down the line when the game is actually finished.
Definitely.
So what are the programs that you have to use for, let's say specifically for what you do?
Yeah. And, for example, of a workflow of like, if I'm creating a fantasy map or something like that. It's actually the same workflow, but I start off with the data in GIS software, so geographic information systems, and I typically use QGIS because it's free and open source, but there's also like proprietary software made by Esri, ArcMap, and things like that. And so that's where I sort of do the data management and some initial cartography decisions of like, how do these colors interplay with each other? And then, sometimes if it's a paper map or a static map, then I'll just export that to Photoshop, Illustrator, to in Adobe Suite to kind of make some final tweaks and just move things around manually, like the layout portions of it, like the title or the legend, whatever. But and otherwise, I'll move it to Mapbox or some other interactive mapping platform where that data is hosted, and then I can pull it in and then make some design decisions in a different tool suite of tools.
And you mentioned legends, and I wanted to touch on that as well. I started playing. I think it was Just Cause 4, and the legend for that is massive. There must be 24 different key items to look for. So when you're building a map, is that something you have to keep in mind? Like, okay, there's going to be 18 different side quests that they're going to have little icons for. So I have to make sure I'm scaling this map so that all of this doesn't just turn into a giant muddied mess.
Yeah, that's a great question because, I think if it's docked away, like, if you can pull it up and you don't have to do it, but at the same time, if there are so many different icons that, and that legend's going to be massive and they're not necessarily intuitive, maybe there's some other design decisions that could be made to sort of ease that burden on the user. Like Skyrim, for example, I don't know. Do they have a legend? I was just going to say they might
Been
not.
a while. I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't either. But they've got icons that are definitely indicative of like, okay, so the major cities have their own unique ones, but then different dungeons. Okay, so this is how these dungeons look versus this is how a dragon roost sort of looks and things like that. And I think if you can sort of keep it simplified and keep the number of classifications of icons down so that they're recognizable and it's not too much of a hassle to pull up the legend and be like, oh, what is this? And you scroll through forever. That's just not a good experience.
No, it feels like work.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say back in StarCraft or Warcraft 3 days, they came up with a map editor. And obviously it's nowhere near the same thing that you do. But would you consider that like a level of cartography? Like when you say cartography, what's the scope of it specifically?
For sure. And I would say, yeah, it is. And I don't like to gatekeep, especially in map making. Like if you've put points on a Google map, I'd consider you, a form of cartographer. And I think that's the beauty of cartography nowadays is that we're making a lot of tools for people to make their own maps. And it's important that we all understand, like, what are the implications behind mapping and things like that. But level editors, I think that's a very cool form of cartography. And it goes beyond that, too, of like designing space, like urban planning and these sort of other real world applications that are kind of tied to cartography in ways of we're designing a space, we're designing a level, a map for people to play in. And if it's not fun, then like, I've failed my job. And so like there's definitely an art to it. And I think you're using different tools that were given to you to sort of create this map in space. And so I would consider it a form of cartography.
Okay. And you touched on a little point where you have to build it to make it fun. It has to be fun for the user. So when you're building maps, you're not just worried about the practicality of it. You also have to be worried about, in a video game setting, you also have to be worried about, is this entertaining? Is somebody going to be looking at this map? And not just staring, of course, at the screen of the map, but like going through it. Is this going to be something that they enjoy doing, or is this going to be like Mad Max, where it's just a big open sandy world where there's nothing to do?
And there's fun parts about that too, but like you have to give like I think of my first experiences in that game level editing. It was Age of Mythology had one, as well as the one I really got into was in Halo 3 with Forge and sort of designing those maps. And you have a little bit less freedom because you're stuck in, the predefined space, but you can design the elements. And some people, man, they would just go crazy and they would they would like glitch things so that you couldn't actually get past, and then they just like design these things, and it was beautiful.
And it's kind of what Minecraft has turned into, I guess. It's just people building, maps of everything that I've seen.
Oh yeah.
Recreations of like Lord of the Rings maps, and so it's. I think Denmark was turned into like the entire nation of Denmark.
Yeah, here's a scale,
Yeah.
to scale thing of Helm's Deep or Denmark. It's
Yeah.
got it all.
We actually have a question from Jay Harowitz. How do I do that? There we go. Within the context of game development, have you seen Mapbox used in building the map behind game environments?
Yeah, Mapbox has I think they've got a Unity engine. And there's someone who works at Mapbox that I've had followed on Twitter. I can't remember their name, but they showed off like some really cool things of how they brought the real world data into like almost like this. It looked like a command center of like rising out of a floor, and then you could like scroll and then see like this world on top of it, and it was like the Mapbox data. I'll have to try to find that, but yeah, so they've got some things that I think at right now maybe mostly support mobile gaming, but don't quote me on that. That's just my impression of location-based games, because that's a big thing too of integrating real-world mapping and games.
Okay. Thank you for the question. If you guys do have any other questions, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, thank you.
Either Ross or I would be happy to. If it's about maps, Ross is going to have to take it. But
you can give it a shot.
I think
you've done a level editor. You're a cartographer.
God, I was terrible with Warcraft. Terrible. And I forgot that Age of Mythology it had it. I think the most recent one I touched on was when Doom had its level editor.
Oh.
And I have no sense of scale or anything, so I applaud you for being able to do something like this. So he brought up Mapbox, and you use an open source program now. If you were to build a map for a game, would you stick with what you have now, or would you kind of expand to something maybe a little more advanced, if there is something more advanced?
Yeah, I mean, it would probably, I guess I can't say I haven't fully worked on games, because I did an independent study where I like learned Unity a little bit, and so learned a little bit of C# to do such things. And I guess it would probably have to meet the demands of whatever this game's being built in. And I know several have gaming engines and typically go by C#, but I'm not. Don't quote me on that. You know more about that than I do.
All right. So you haven't yet worked on a game, or you haven't worked on a full game, or because again, you've done the D&D map, which I saw, which is on your website, and I encourage everybody to look at it. Is it part of your career path? Would you veer off specifically into video game map creation, or do you want to kind of stick to real world creation for everyday practical use?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be opposed to it. I don't know if it's something I don't pursue right now. I'm pretty happy with a lot of the ways that I do mapping, and my plate is usually pretty full, and to not have to do things. But in the future, for sure, I would be open to it. And actually, Stamen has been working on some cool stuff. I'm not sure exactly what I can say or not, but they've done some cool things. There was somebody who was working with us for a while doing one of our mapping projects and kind of translating it over to Unity. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely a potential for me to sort of answer that call if it's in the future.
Okay. Is there any reason why you would kind of be averted to it? Is there something about building a map for a video game that is maybe not as appealing as it sounds?
I don't know. Not off the top of my head. And maybe it's because I haven't had any experience with it or anything, that it just sounds super cool.
Okay. Besides, I guess, the criticism that you could get from, the mouths of YouTube.
Oh yeah, for sure. I would, probably just ignore that. But
Yeah.
I would doom scroll for sure.
Yeah, you're best to do so. Do you have any projects, personal projects, or anything that you want to plug? You breezed through my questions a lot quicker than I expected, and kind of touched on everything in in depth. So if you had anything you wanted to plug or anything you wanted to talk about, actually, we have another question. Oh, yeah. So you hold off, Ross. Yeah. So Jay Horowitz again, would you have any advice for individuals with a GIS background who are interested in game development?
Yeah. I would just say probably kind of wrapping back around to that technology thing is learn these, maybe dabble in some programming. So if you have a GIS background, maybe you've got a little bit in Python. I would definitely learn Python also just for GIS stuff. But then getting into understanding how you can build things with programming, and whether that takes you to web mapping of JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and other sort of web mapping technologies, but also maybe try to make an interactive map in a game engine, and kind of mess around with that. And maybe Mark, you know some stuff too of like what sort of, if someone who has got mapping knowledge, how do they bring that and make that marketable to you as someone who works in the games industry?
That's a good question. As somebody who focuses primarily on the written aspect of everything as a content writer, that may be a little beyond my scope, but I would say, video gaming it's a conglomeration of just about everything. There's written, there's visuals. So, if you know how to build a map, if you know what you're doing and kind of what programs to use, there is definitely something that you can add to the melting pot. You may not be specifically used to actually build like a physical map that somebody will look at and scroll through, but it also has to do with world building. We talked earlier about terrain and kind of just the layout of the world. That can all kind of, I would think, work into that. Yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question at all.
And I also think part of my thesis was originally going to be talking to a bunch of game designers and developers to sort of like talk to them about how they thought about maps. And I actually had a great chat with the Team Cherry, who made Hollow Knight, which is a great cartographic like centric game. But the reason I was doing that was because wanted to do this, and everything that I learned was basically from going to conferences and talking to some indie developers around the Madison and Milwaukee area, was that if you are trying to pitch yourself to a games company, they want to see things that you've made. And so if you're coming in as a cartographer and wanting to make them want you, I think that it kind of comes back to just making something and showing how it's been made, and as well as if it can benefit them and work within their sort of design and development pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great question.
If you have something that you think would remotely work for a developer, it's definitely worth bringing it up to them. And I know a lot of AAA developers use a lot of in-house, but a lot of indie developers, which I think the team behind Hollow Knight is, they're an indie developer. Indie developers outsource a lot. I would say if this is anything that anybody watching, or even Ross, if it ever came to you and you were kind of curious, there are a lot of Facebook groups of indie developers looking for outsourced work. And I've come across a couple of posts, more so world building, but I think also that would translate to them as somebody who knows how to kind of build a full map. So again, thank you for the question. The thesis is, I actually have this written down, how to play maps, right?
How to play with maps.
How to play with maps. I know if you Google it, it is there on Google, like the first or second. There's a couple of links that lead just to the references. If I can pull it up, I would gladly add it to the list, but my keyboard makes a lot of noise.
I think, let me see if I can. Put it in chat here too.
Yeah, I think you should have access to it. It is a lengthy read, but from what I did, perfect. From what I did read of it, you were kind of spot on with a lot of points.
Oh, thanks. It was interesting. It is a very lengthy read, and mostly because, and my my advisor, Rob Roth at UW-Madison, was incredibly supportive, and just, you know, I have to give a lot of credit to his support and how I made that come to a reality. But part of his, like, what he recommended is that, like, okay, so these are pretty disparate in terms of the research world. So you need to have a lengthy literature review of why these are important, and both from gaming and mapping standpoints, and then try to synthesize those reasons why they should bridge. So that's part of why it gets lengthy. Also, there's a lot of pictures too. So
that's right. There were a couple of pictures. Did anybody like look at you sideways when you said, "Hey, this is what I'm going to do my thesis on," and it's, you know, it's going to be typical thesis length?
Yeah, it was kind of like there was mixed responses of like, "Oh wow, good for you," and then you know, it was kind of a gimmicky thing for me to bring up that, like, oh, you know, I got my department to buy me $500 worth of video games for a scholarship and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it was sort of mixed stuff. And like, some people were like, came with some really interesting questions. I was like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of that. But then others were like, oh, wow, you haven't grown up.
Yeah. Man, it's sad because you wrote that thesis in what, 2015, 2016, 2016?
2018 is when I finished it.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And we're still looking at games as, you know, this immature medium, which is sad. Especially, I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge out there, as you proved, by being able to kind of create something that long and then not, you know, not ramble. You make good, you know, it's a thesis full of, you know, information that is all pertaining to this one genre that people still look down upon.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different conversation.
Well, I mean, I guess it's funny because like mapping is such a kind of a niche thing too, that like when I tell people not only like that I was doing my video game thesis, you know, on video game maps, but I also just tell people that I make maps, and they're like, you're a cartographer? Like, are you out there in like the field, like scrawling with a quill and pen, like, or haven't all the maps been made? And which is like, if you talk to any cartographer or map making folks, and I'm some GIS folks in the chat will kind of know these sort of memey concepts that we just toss around it to each other on Twitter. And
just, I mean, it's I guess as somebody who doesn't know much about map making as a career, I guess I could see that viewpoint. You know, GPSs have been around since commercially, since like 2000, early 2000s, I would say 2004. So yeah, I guess the idea of, oh yeah, this has been made, so what are you guys actually doing?
Yeah, right. We've mapped the world. What else is there?
I mean, it's important. I know for myself, but I mean, you know, they update things regularly. You know, new streets, new everything. So that's all kind of built into that.
And every 4 years in America, there's tons of political maps being made to like show that data too, and lots of really cool and interesting ways.
Very true. And I think a lot of people don't realize who's behind that. I think they think, you know, somebody plugs in a couple of numbers and that's it.
For sure.
So you guys are kind of behind, you know, you guys are the heroes behind the scene doing things that nobody's going to ever give you credit for.
Yeah. In many cases, there are just some brilliant cartographers and spatial thinkers that like go behind a lot of data now.
Okay. That's actually, you know, again, as somebody who's not into cartography at all or knows much about it, that's always interesting to hear.
Yeah.
So yeah, if again, I said earlier, if there's anything you want to plug, Ross, go for it. If you want to plug your website or anything like that, because I know you also do freelancing as you can, but you know, this is your platform too.
Yeah, I started Red Giant Maps is the name of my personal company, and I do those interactive fantasy maps. Not really taking commissions right now, but it's always, you know, check them out. The Critical Role map is really cool. The whole world of theirs is amazing, and it was a fun thing to map. And yeah, I've got a Twitch channel too, and sometimes I stream like mapping tutorials, and like that Animal Crossing one I think I made in a tutorial stream of just like me mapping and kind of trying to answer questions as I go along. So sometimes I'll do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, guys, follow him on Twitch as well. I believe you are broadcasting us onto yours as well. So if we have follows over there, you guys feel free to follow Epic. We do interviews as often as we can with game developers, people that work in industries that would probably align with game development, as Ross right here. But if there are no other questions, and if Ross, you have, there we go. Ross's Twitch channel is now in the chat. Feel free to grab that. And if there's any information here that everybody wants to grab, we will be putting this on our YouTube channel within the week. It's going to be YouTube Epoch Xperience. And Ross, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you again soon.